In the previous video, we have talked about the sexual reproduction in flowers. Now let us try and understand few terminologies. We have talked about that fertilization in flowers, both unisexual and bisexual, it happens due to pollination. So let us try and understand what is pollination. Pollination is the process of transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the flower. What does that mean? Actually, when the flower is matured, or all the gametes, that is the pollen grains and the ovules, are properly mature, then in the flower, within the anther, are the pollen grains. When the anther ruptures, these pollen grains need to land on suitable stigma. And this, unless and until this happens, there will be no fertilization. So it is the process of transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the flower. The pollination is an important process which should happen to bring about the fertilization. Now there are two types of pollination when we talk. One is the self-pollination and the second is cross-pollination. What do we mean by self-pollination? When the pollen grains from the anther of the flower lands onto the stigma of the same plant. That means there is no change of the plant and it happens within the same plant. Then in such case it is known as self-pollination. Self-pollination, it has to be in the same flower. On the other hand, the cross-pollination is when the pollen grains land onto the stigma of the different plants of the same species. So that means if this is the anther having the pollen grains and when this are released, they land onto the stigma of the different plant, not on the same plant, and the species should be the same. So what happens is the stigma of the pollen grain will land from one plant to the stigma of the other plant of the same species. Now this pollination has to, like pollen grains after bursting, they need a media by which they can be carried to the stigma of the flower. And that is what we mean by agents of pollination. So agents of pollination are those things that help in bringing about the pollination. Now we classify the agents of pollination into two types, biotic and abiotic. Biotic agents such as birds, insects, bats, etc., they help in bringing about the pollination. For example, the honeybees, the birds which suck the nectar, the pollen grains get attached to their legs, and when they land onto the stigma, as I told you in the previous video, stigma is also sticky. So as a result, the pollen grains stick to the stigma and this is how the pollination is brought about. Same way with the wind. The pollen grains are very light in weight and they can be easily carried away by the wind. So when the anther bursts, these pollen grains land onto the stigma and then the fertilization happens. So pollination is an important phenomena that has to take place prior to bring about the fertilization. Now, after the pollen grain, we have studied that after the pollen grain lands onto the suitable stigma, that means it has to be of the same species compulsorily. So when it lands onto the stigma, there is development of the pollen tube. Now there is a term called as double fertilization. Fertilization is the process of fusing of the male and the female gamete. Double fertilization, what is this? What does this mean? Double fertilization actually happens in angiosperms, and it is actually what happens is when the pollen tube develops, we have studied this structure, when the pollen tube develops from here to which and it reaches to the ovule, we have studied. So it carries the male gametes within, and there are two male gametes over there. So out of the two male gametes, one of the male gamete fuses with the egg cell. So one double fertilization, we are trying to understand, one male gamete plus egg cell, that means it fuses with the egg cell. Egg cell is present over here in the middle and it fuses over here. That results into the formation of zygote. Correct? So this is known, this helps in the formation of zygote. The second male gamete, fuses with two polar nuclei. The polar nuclei we have studied. If the embryo sac has this structure, the center are the two polar nuclei we have studied, and these three are, this is the egg cell and these two are the polar nuclei. So one of the male gamete fuses with the two polar nuclei to form an endosperm. Now since there is fusion of two male gametes, that is, one fertilizes the egg cell to form the zygote, whereas the other fuses with the two polar nuclei to form an endosperm. This is what is meant by double fertilization. So this is a characteristic of angiosperm. So double fertilization happens only in angiosperms, and it is defined as a process of flowering plants in which two male gametes are released and are used in fertilization. One male gamete fuses with the egg to form the zygote, whereas the second male gamete fuses with the two polar nuclei to form an endosperm.